Okay, so by now, you have some feel for what machine learning is and how it differs from traditional coding we're used to. But there are slight variations to this model, and that's what we'll take a look at in this video. They're all basically offshoots of the same input function output idea of machine learning, but these variations are still different in important ways, so we're going to take a deeper look at them. We can divide these variations into three different types of learning: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. What we learned so far is more precisely categorized as supervised learning. Why is it called supervised? Because we, and by that I mean the coder who's building the machine learning model, must specifically tell the model what output we want. In other words, we must provide the model with the correct answer, the label. In the previous video, we looked at a simplified model without this label to make things less confusing, but in reality, the model needs a correct answer to compare its outputs to in order to learn. So the output here would be whatever the machine actually outputs from this function. It's whatever it thinks is the right answer. The label here is what we, the coder, provide as the correct answer. And by comparing its own output with this correct answer, the label, the machine can slowly change this function on its own to get closer to the right answer. So term label actually comes from image recognition. For example, if we want the model to learn a photo of a dog is a dog, we label all dog photos in our data set as a dog. So the input would be the actual picture of the dog, and then the label would be the word dog. This concept of supervised learning is more clearly understood when we contrast it to unsupervised learning. We simply give it an input and do not specify the output that we want. So we don't provide the model with the correct answer or the label. To get a better idea of these two types of learning, think about how a child learns. There are times she employs a supervised learning method. For instance, given an apple, her mom might tell her that it's called an apple. Here, her mom is giving her an input, the actual apple, and also giving her the correct answer, which is the word apple. At other times, the child employs unsupervised learning. It might look at a banana and learn that it's different from an apple. The mom doesn't have to teach her that banana is different from an apple. The child will look at the differences, the look, the smell, the taste, etc., and figure out that it's a different fruit on her own. You see why it's called supervised and unsupervised? Supervised learning requires a human to interfere. We must provide the right answer for each input. Unsupervised learning, on the other hand, doesn't require such human interference. The model can simply observe the world and learn something from it. It only needs the inputs, but no label. Now, how would this unsupervised learning work? How can a machine learning model figure out what the function is if we don't tell it what output that we expect? One way it does this is to simply look for differences. Here's a simple example. Pictures of apples and bananas. Given these pictures, a machine learning model can separate the two. It can do that because apples and bananas will have clear differences between them, say a shape and a color. And the model can separate them without us telling it specifically which is an apple and which is a banana. Incidentally, this is a technique Max Levchin employed at PayPal for fraud detection. As you can see, fundamentally it's no different than apples and bananas example. Assuming most normal transactions have certain common characteristics, a fraudulent activity must stand out from the rest. The unsupervised algorithm simply detects an outlier. Another really cool example of unsupervised learning is in natural language processing. GPT-3 is all the rage in AI community these days with its unprecedented language processing abilities. This is slightly different than the apples and bananas and fraud detection example. We don't have to manually label the desired output for the model, but instead of detecting differences between inputs, it takes a small section of the text and uses a larger section as a desired output. This is how language processing models learn to generate text. For instance, given a sentence, "we're going to die," and that makes us the lucky ones, the model would take "we" and will try to guess the next word, and the right answer would be "are." Then it will give itself "we are" and try to guess the next word, and then the right word would be "going," so on and so forth. Given a large corpus of text, it learns to predict the next word well enough to start sounding like a real human. So in this case, The left side here would be the input, and then the right side would be the label. Note that this is different from supervised learning where we have to manually give it the label, right? This sentence already contains input and label. So this is an example of unsupervised learning where humans do not have to provide labels manually. Now, why do this in the first place? Why do we need unsupervised learning? Because supervised learning model, by definition, needs humans to do the upfront work of labeling all the data, and that can be really expensive. For example, if we want to build a machine learning model that labels the breed of a dog by looking at dog photos, we would have to provide the model with photos of dogs that are all labeled with a correct breed. This can be very costly because humans would have to label each picture before the model can learn anything from it. Unsupervised models, on the other hand, would require no such labeling. The downside of unsupervised learning has been that we couldn't apply to all problems. For image recognition tasks, for example, supervised learning worked much better so far. But things seem to be changing. Unsupervised learning models are becoming a lot more important. Powerful new architectures have recently been discovered, like the variational autoencoders and transformers, which is what GPT-3 uses, both of which have showed state-of-the-art results in important fields like computer vision and language processing. Personally, I think this area will be far more interesting in the future. Why? Just think about how babies learn. How much of it is supervised? It's surprisingly little. Most of it is unsupervised learning. Parents think they're teaching their children what an apple is, for example, but they're actually not. The child learns most things about the apple on her own, which is to say she's doing unsupervised learning. She learns all the properties of the apple, shape, color, smell, and even how it differs from other objects like a book, on her own. The only thing that the parents do is to give it a label, apple. In fact, at that point, the child doesn't even care if it's called an apple or some other word in another language. So I think a large part of learning has to be unsupervised. Now, if unsupervised learning is such an important part of learning, why didn't we use it before? Why is this just getting more important? Turns out, unsupervised learning models require a somewhat more advanced architecture and a lot more computing power. We just didn't have the right algorithms and large enough computing power for it to work really well. But with new architectures like the transformer and exponentially increasing computing power, I think we will see this type of unsupervised learning methods employed in far more areas going forward. Okay, there's one more significant variation of machine learning called reinforcement learning. This model is slightly different from both supervised and unsupervised learning. It takes inputs and label, which is called a reward, but the label is infrequent and often time delayed. For example, if you want a machine to play a computer game like Super Mario, you cannot provide a desired outcome for each action Mario will take. For instance, if the machine were to make Mario jump, we don't know if it's good or bad, or how to provide a proper reward for that single action. Instead, we can let the machine play with Mario for the entire level and see if it successfully completes the level. If it does, we might give him, say, a score of 100, which is a reward, and if he dies before the end, we might give him a score of -100. Then the model will figure out how to maximize the reward by trying different things. Hopefully you already see why it's called reinforcement learning. It's based on giving reinforcement, or a reward, for correct actions. You can see how tricky it might be to design a model like this though. You only have indirect influence on the actions of the model. But it's also easy to see how this more closely resembles the real world in complex decision making. When we teach a child, for example, we often employ this kind of reward-punishment incentives to steer them to a better outcome. Reinforcement learning has been particularly successful in the area of games, like chess or StarCraft. There has been a really good advancement in this area in recent years. OpenAI, for instance, has now produced world champions in Dota 2, which is one of the most complex cooperative computer games out there. Amazingly, the same model has been tweaked to solve hand dexterity problems in robotics, which speaks to the generality of these awesome machine learning models. By the way, all these models now employ variations of deep learning techniques we will be learning in this course. Now, these variations are sufficiently different to be categorized separately, and they all use somewhat different algorithms to solve problems. But underneath, they are all still just variations of this input function output model. Keeping that in mind will make it easier for you to tell the difference and employ the right type of solution for the problem you're trying to solve. Okay, let's do a quick recap. Supervised learning is where we give an input and a desired output, or a label, and let the machine figure out what the function is. With unsupervised learning, in contrast, we do not specify a desired output. It simply takes a bunch of inputs and try to figure out a function that separates the inputs based on their differences, like how it separates a fraudulent transaction from a normal transaction. Or it takes a different chunk of the input data, like in the case of models like GPT-3. Either way, it doesn't require manual human labeling. Reinforcement is somewhat like supervised learning in that we give it an input and a desired output, but the output is only given sometimes and often in a time-delayed manner, like how we only tell the machine if it did well at the end of each level in Super Mario rather than for each action. In this course, we'll focus exclusively on supervised learning. Educationally, this is the best place to start, and most machine learning models today use deep learning techniques underneath. So having a solid intuitive understanding of deep learning will almost certainly make it easier for you to get to the cutting edge of AI.